Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad are often put in the category of character-driven shows, and people will say things like, those shows have great characters. But what exactly does that mean? Because there are plenty of other movies and shows I love, with characters I like, but there's just something special about the characters of Better Call Saul. Quick warning, spoilers ahead for all of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul up to Season 6, Episode 6. There are a few basics you need to get right for any character to make a story work. First, they need to feel real. That doesn't mean they need to be realistic, but they have to be recognizable as human, acting in a way that we can understand. Even animated movies starring anthropomorphized animals have to get this right for the movie to work. Emphasis on anthropomorphized, which means to attribute human characteristics. There are, of course, exceptions to this in every storytelling rule. For example, some of the classic Will Ferrell or Adam Sandler comedies probably wouldn't work if those characters acted realistically. But drama and suspense will usually benefit from real characters. Otherwise, it'd be difficult for the story to activate the sympathy and empathy that gets us to care what happens next. Does Better Call Saul get this right? Absolutely. And you can see how painstakingly the writers work to get it right. One of the best examples of this is how much is left unspoken by the characters. For example, in the first episode of a series, writers usually have the task of establishing all the characters and their relationships to one another. So in the first episode of Better Call Saul, you'd expect at some point for the show to make it explicit that Jimmy and Chuck are brothers. But if you rewatch the episode, you'll notice that it's possible to watch the entire thing and not realize it. That's because in the real world, people don't unnecessarily explain their relationships out loud. Vince Gilligan even joked about this on the first episode of Better Call Saul's Insider podcast.
The beauty for me, and I want to give hats off to Sony and AMC. I want to give a tip of the hat to them because, let me tell you, I've worked for other networks that, if they got this script that we wrote, they'd be like, wait a minute, you got to explain this. You have to have the scene where Jimmy says to Chuck, how long have we been brothers? How long has it been since you came down with your terrible allergy to electricity?
After hearing this example, I can't tell you how hard it is to not notice it in almost everything else I watch. Just pay attention. Next time you hear a character start a sentence with, how long have we been blank? Or we haven't spoken in 5 years? You can be certain you're about to enter exposition mode, meaning a character is talking in a way that's meant more to inform the audience than to actually be something the character wants to say. The other example would be how these characters rarely discuss their feelings or what's on their mind. Instead, a lingering look or a thoughtful gaze is all we get as a clue to what they're thinking. Kim looks at the stopper she kept as a souvenir from her first time as Giselle, telling us that she's tempted to pull another scam, or the mention of Spice Girls gets Gus's gears turning, thinking about Madrigal, and realizing Lalo is likely sniffing around his super lab. All these choices to use characters only as characters, and never as a mouthpiece for unearned plot progression or exposition, add to the realism necessary for characters to work. And one choice which really makes these shows stand out is that the characters, to say the least, are flawed. It may shock you to learn this, but in the real world, most of us have flaws, and we sometimes do things we know we shouldn't, hurting ourselves or loved ones in the process. And this is one area which feels like it's so apparent, I don't think you need me to go down a list of all the ways these characters are flawed. The topic of making characters feel real could be its own video, so I'll just mention one more thing before moving on. In my Importance of Detail video, I talked about how the little details make the world of Better Call Saul feel more real. As a result, when shocking things happen, they land with more impact because we're bought into the story as a space where real things are happening. The same is true for the characters. Knowing that Kim has an affinity for classic movies like The Thing or Ice Station Zebra does more than just show us where Jimmy got the name for his loan-out company. It's also one detail that tells us Kim Wexler has a personality, preferences, hobbies, and interests like a real human being. When we see Werner's wife for the first time, Marguerite, we find her at a bar answering questions as an eavesdropper in someone else's trivia game. This small window into how she spends her free time gives the feeling that even though Better Call Saul hasn't pointed the camera at her before, doesn't mean she hasn't existed. She finds ways to fill the time and entertain herself. She exists as a human being and not just an NPC to be used in Lalo's pursuit of the proof he's looking for. So, characters have to feel real. Check. Besides that, they should also inspire empathy, because the best stories make us feel something, and usually, what we're feeling is a degree of what the protagonist is feeling. When Jimmy is told by Chuck to stop practicing under the name McGill, we feel Jimmy's frustration. When Nacho, rest in peace, has to befriend Lalo on Gus's orders, we feel his nerves. And why do we share in their emotions? Empathy. To be clear, that doesn't mean the character has to be likable or even entirely relatable, but it does mean that there has to be something there for us to latch onto, some kind of emotional foothold, so while they're driving through the story, we can at least sit in the passenger seat next to them. Take Gus, for example. If you focus only on his actions while in the antagonist role, it's hard to feel much for him. He's a calculating businessman who kills in cold blood and uses innocent lives as bargaining chips, like Nacho's father or Walter's infant daughter. But Breaking Bad did offer that emotional foothold. Max. It'd be one thing if the show told us Hector killed someone very important to Gus, but they did more than that. They used flashback, because they knew that showing us this moment would have a lot more impact than just mentioning it. Watching the two partners pitch their meth business to Don Eladio was uncomfortable, because they were clearly out of their element. Then it became intense when Eladio lifted the facade and showed his anger at their manipulating him into a meeting. Finally, watching Hector shoot Max in cold blood, it's hard not to feel Gus's grief and anger, especially considering the change in pace from his usual calm demeanor. Suddenly, while still fearing Gus as an antagonist, we could sometimes get in the passenger seat next to him when Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul choose to focus on him as the protagonist of a scene or sequence. Outside Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, one of my favorite examples that shows both sides of the coin is the Joker. In The Dark Knight, we were offered no emotional foothold for the character, and that was intentional, because he was meant to be a mysterious agent of chaos. We were never meant to be with him as a protagonist. We were only with our other characters, feeling a degree of what they feel when confronted with the Joker. Fear. But the movie Joker clearly took a different approach. We aren't necessarily meant to like this character, at least not by the end of the movie, but we are firmly with him as a protagonist the entire film. Similar to the approach with Gus, we see how Arthur Fleck is mistreated and why he would feel the world is so unfair to those less privileged. By choosing whether or not to inspire empathy, the same character can be made an antagonist, protagonist, or a little bit of both. So you've got realism and empathy. What else do you need? Well, to get a viewer to pick up on either of those things, you need that viewer to watch your show or movie in the first place. Maybe the first prerequisite for a great character is that they need to somehow grab our attention. Once we're paying attention, then you can establish realism and empathy. How do you make a character worth paying attention to? There are a lot of different ways. Action movies usually do it by making a character funny, likable, and skilled. We like to be charmed by confidence, we like to laugh, and we like to see competence on display. Just look at any one of the many scenes of Mike doing something smart or impressive. And there's a reason why Marvel kicked off its cinematic universe with Tony Stark. Charming, funny, and intelligent. Another approach is to make a character interesting or novel, meaning they're a window into something we aren't used to seeing. By making its characters so morally gray, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul kind of have that novelty baked into the premise. Most of us aren't involved in the cartel or dealing in life and death stakes on a daily basis. So these characters offer to show us something we don't normally see. They pique our curiosity. So how did Jimmy McGill get our attention? All of the above. As a supporting character in Breaking Bad, he did it by being funny and competent. From his over-the-top commercials and colorful way of speaking, he was hilarious and especially stood out given the grim world surrounding him. In terms of competence, there's just so much fun watching him confidently stroll into a room and go toe-to-toe with law enforcement. In Better Call Saul, when he moved into the protagonist role, he also became unexpectedly likable, considering we first met him as a scumbag lawyer. One of the most universally beloved character templates is the underdog. We love to see someone trying their hardest, despite the odds stacked against them. That's where we find Jimmy McGill at the start of Better Call Saul. In the opening minutes of the series, we see him fighting hard for a PD case he has no shot at winning, and we know his attempt is earnest because, even behind closed doors, we see him practicing the defense. He finds the one place offering a semblance of privacy, the courthouse bathroom, and psychs himself up before he's summoned to court. And by the way, Gene aside, we start the series in a bathroom, and that toilet humor, 7 years later, is still a staple of the show. Besides his likability as an underdog, Jimmy McGill also, of course, carries on Saul Goodman's legacy as a funny and skilled talker. Although Jimmy loses that first unwinnable case, defending a few kids who got into some adolescent shenanigans. The second episode sees him negotiate with perhaps the least reasonable person in the Breaking Bad universe, Tuco Salamanca. Jimmy talks him down from executing the skateboarders who insulted his abuelita to just breaking their legs. And of course, there's intrigue built into the Jimmy McGill character because we know he becomes Saul Goodman, which begs the question of how and why. So the characters of this world all meet the prerequisites of great characters. They feel real, they invite some form of empathy, and they demand our attention. All of that is step one. That's what gets us interested in following these characters. But where Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad really stand out is in what they do next. They change their characters. That's no surprise. Breaking Bad was not shy about telling us its thesis. Mr. White essentially laid out some of the themes in the first episode.
It is growth, then decay, then transformation.
And going into Better Call Saul, we know where Jimmy McGill ends up, so we knew he would have to go through some kind of transformation. But what's less obvious is why that necessarily makes for a better story. Think about the stories that most engage you and most keep your attention. Those stories all make you do two things: want and worry. They make you want to see what happens next, but also worry about what happens next. When the two collide, you get suspense. I want to know if that bomb will go off, and I worry if it'll hurt my favorite characters. Those feelings are usually about the plot. Will they stop the bad guy? And what happens if they don't? But if your story has characters that change, suddenly we won't just want and worry for plot, but also character. Now the stakes are higher, and there's even more substance to hold our attention. For example, back in Season 3, Jimmy and Chuck were at war with each other. Chuck was trying to get Jimmy disbarred for his meddling with the Mesa Verde documents. In a plot-driven show, our only concern would be, will Jimmy best Chuck and continue to be a lawyer? But as a character-driven show, we're also concerned with, what will this do to Jimmy? How will fighting his older brother, the only family he has left, change Jimmy as a person? And because this show isn't afraid to change characters for the worse, we also worry about the answers to those questions. So our suspense is multiplied. We worry about the plot, what will actually happen, but also the characters. What will this do to them? Will these actions further corrupt them? On a basic level, storytelling works when it has us asking questions and dying to know the answers. Simply put, when characters can change, the story has us asking even more questions. As a prequel, Better Call Saul is more dependent on this than most stories, because when we know where it's heading, some of our curiosity around plot is already satisfied, so the show has to make us curious about the characters. But with a character like Kim Wexler, where her future is an open book, you can see the doubling up effect at work. You can see in the fandom that Kim's fate is equally debated on both levels. Fans discuss the question of, will she survive the series? That's the plot level. But in equal measure, they discuss the question of, will she break bad? That's the character level. The amount of discourse on both questions shows the series at work in both plot and character. Besides changing its characters, Better Call Saul also makes its characters complicated, meaning their desires and motivations aren't always obvious. Short term, they are usually clear because they have to be for the story to work. For example, we need to know that Kim wants to tear down Howard in season 6, so we know what we're rooting for or against. But there's plenty of discussion to be had around why she wants this. And in fact, I doubt even she has a clear answer. She might tell you that it's to settle Sandpiper and use the money to do good, a worthy trade for damaging one man's career. But more and more, we're seeing that she has the opportunity to do the good she wants without the Sandpiper settlement. Breaking Bad threw a similar wrench. Walter's stated desire was to make money for his family. When Elliot and Gretchen offered to help financially and Walter turned them down, suddenly his motivation wasn't as clear. And suddenly, you can add even more questions to the pile. Why was Walter White so drawn to the world of cooking meth? Or in Kim's case, what will happen to her? What will it do to her character? And now we can add some of those why questions. Why is she doing all this? Why did she choose to marry Jimmy after he betrayed her? Why is she so drawn to grifts and schemes? And every one of these questions is another reason we keep watching and another reason we spend so much time discussing this show. It's also all very true to life. In reality, people do change and they are complicated. You can probably think of many things you've done in your life where you're still asking yourself, why? So in terms of making characters that feel real and true to life, Better Call Saul nails it. This complexity also lets the characters surprise us. As an audience, we love to be surprised in a way that feels earned. We love a plot twist that doesn't feel like it completely came out of nowhere. Well, Better Call Saul offers character twists. Jimmy gives a heartfelt speech about Chuck, only to reveal it was a ruse the entire time. Kim decides they should get married, and of course, Kim's suggestion that they go after Howard to force the Sandpiper settlement. All these twists only work because the characters are complex enough that their actions aren't entirely predictable, even to themselves. I doubt Season 1 Kim knew where she'd be in Season 6. All this is why the characters of the series feel special, and a big part of what we mean by character-driven, though we also mean it in a very literal sense. More than most stories, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are driven by characters' choices. There are great stories to be told about unexpected tragedies, natural disasters, or external threats, and seeing how characters deal with them. But Better Call Saul is a different kind of story. Most of the time, it's not trouble that finds the characters, but characters that find trouble. In the current season, the main conflict for Jimmy and Kim is one they signed up for. They chose to pursue this plan to bruise Howard. Even the looming threat of Lalo is one that Jimmy invited. He chose to take the bagman job, and way back in his father's store, he chose to steal, taking his first steps down Bad Choice Road. By making authentic, empathetic, and intriguing characters, Better Call Saul gets our attention. By making those characters complex, ever-changing, and letting their choices drive the story, Better Call Saul makes them truly special. And as a result, even once the few remaining episodes wrap the series up, I think we'll all remember these characters for years to come. Anyway, I think we can wrap it up there. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more. With that, thank you for watching, and see you on the next One Take.